As you've probably heard by now, we've teamed up with BetMGM this season. We'll be using BetMGM lines to make all of our picks, and we'll have special offers for our listeners each week. If you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager with BetMGM. Here's how it works. Download the BetMGM app and sign up using bonus code The Athletic. Make your first deposit of at least $10. Place your first bet on any game and claim your voucher for a 1-year subscription to The Athletic. See BetMGM.com for terms. U.S. promotional offers not available in D.C., Mississippi, New York, Nevada, Ontario, or Puerto Rico. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Available in the U.S. Call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369 in New York. Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP in Arizona. 1-800-327-5050 in Massachusetts. 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan. 1-800-981-0023 in Puerto Rico. First bet offer for new customers only in partnership with Kansas Crossing Casino and Hotel. Don't forget, if you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager.
The Athletic.
The race is on, and Red Bull is at it again, with Sergio Perez's seat under threat, the possibility of a reshuffle in the summer break, and all sorts of question marks about its long-term lineup. So why is this happening, and what does it tell us about the pressure F1's top team is under? I'm Edd Straw, and joining us to unravel the madness are Mark Hughes and special guest Nelson Valkenburg. Well, Nelson, welcome back to the podcast. We heard from you on our Red Bull launch podcast. For those who don't know, you're, of course, Viaplay Netherlands F1 commentator. So it's been an interesting season for you, hasn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for having me back. It has been a very interesting season, but it didn't look it the first 4 or 5 weekends in, and suddenly it has come alive. It's very interesting and good to live through. Actually,
is the Netherlands enjoying the fact that it's a bit more storied at the front now?
I think everybody does. For the Dutch audience, a hard-fought battle that is won is better than an easy race, and McLaren has a lot of fans in the Netherlands as well, so it's been good.
Yeah, and Max Verstappen's certainly been doing a lot of that. And Mark, have you been enjoying this phase? We are seeing Max Verstappen stretched, and generally he's rising to the occasion, isn't he?
Oh, absolutely, and he's pulling wins out of his hat that probably the car doesn't deserve at the moment in some cases. And we've got that tantalising prospect of McLaren, making that breakthrough into regular winners, and they're fast enough to do it, but they're not quite seasoned enough, and it's just adding more texture to the season, and gives us plenty to look forward to in the remaining races. Yeah.
And certainly Red Bull as a whole has been doing its best to add plenty of storylines to the season. So we're going to be devoting this podcast to that. And we'll start off with the Sergio Perez situation. And Nelson, there's a serious chance of him being replaced just a month basically after signing his new deal. So how surprised are you by this situation?
It's absolutely bonkers. Why announce someone when there are so many doubts, and when there are apparently machinations going on behind the scenes to get him out anyway? It's just very weird, and it goes to the level of discomfort in that team and dysfunction. It's very weird.
Yeah, it's truly astonishing. It was June the 9th that deal was announced.
Feels like a lifetime ago.
Yeah, it was just before the Canadian Grand Prix, wasn't it? And he was already well into his traditional mid-season slump by then, wasn't he?
Yeah, and maybe they used it to try to get him some momentum and get him some confidence, but clearly that hasn't worked. And yeah, suddenly we're hearing that he may be on the way out. It's absolutely weird.
Yeah, it's quite curious. I've heard it talked about a few times that he's slumped since the deal was done, but that's not the case because he had those 2 races that were pretty poor before that, and it's created this really interesting situation. And the possibility of there being a change, Mark, is absolutely real, isn't it? This isn't just a vaguely rumoured thing. They're genuinely pretty much panicking about the Constructors' Championship at this stage.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's, I say it's a traditional mid-season slump, but it was undesirable before, but it's a proper problem this year now that there are other teams that can punish them, McLaren, Ferrari, Mercedes. There's a real danger now that McLaren in particular can catch Red Bull and the Constructors by the end of the season. They're currently on 79% of Red Bull's score, Whereas after Miami, just before Perez's slump, they were on just 52%. And in the 6 races since then, McLaren have scored 168 points to Red Bull's 132. And that's down to Checo's loss of form and McLaren having 2 fully competitive drivers. That's an average gain of 6 points per race for McLaren, despite several lost victories, which we know about. So Max is over-delivering, sure, but not by as much as Checo is under-delivering. 6 points per race for the remaining 12 races, 72 points. And the Red Bull's currently only 78 ahead. So it's very marginal, even if it just stays like this. And you'd bet McLaren has some wins to come. So, yeah, it brings you back to why he's been re-signed. And I think you, Ed, were spot on when you suggested maybe the possibility it was to insert more demanding clauses, which have not met, would allow them to replace him mid-season and hopefully get someone who can better protect their lead in the constructors. That's the only thing which makes logical sense without knowing exactly what the machinations are within, what is Nelson touched on, is a very volatile team at the moment.
Yeah, my big question is, who is in charge of this situation? Is it Christian Horner? Is it still Red Bull Austria with Helmut Marko? Everything we saw in Austria going around Jos Verstappen and Helmut Marko didn't really inspire confidence that they're on the same page. And it seems to be playing out again in the driver market and around Sergio Perez's position. So it is very volatile, as Mark says.
Yeah, there's so much going on there in terms of the push and pull between the various factions, and this problem's just not going away. It's been there all year. And obviously, Perez in his situation, there's a suggestion that it's a mid-season break, that he needs to be within 100 points of Verstappen for there not to be a brake clause activated. And I think, frankly, with the way the points are, if Verstappen was to just take Spa and Hungary off, I still think Perez wouldn't be able to score the points he'd need to get back into that zone. So it's a really desperate situation, and maybe Perez will have backed himself to turn it around, but not done it. But Mark, why do you think Perez is struggling so much now? Because while a bunch of other cars have kind of slotted into that space, he's also underperforming that. It's not like he's P8 or P6 behind the sort of at the back of the leading 3 or 4 teams, depending on how Ferrari's doing.
Yeah.
He's disappearing in Q1 too often.
Yeah, it's true. And it conforms to the pattern of both 22 and 23 last year. So in 22, he had that great start of the season, possibly doing even more than the Verstappen-centric team was comfortable with, out-qualified Max at Imola, Monaco, under controversial circumstances, Baku. And then he had that terrible mid-season form, 9 races on the bounce where he's just nowhere near the pace, before then making a respectable comeback in the last 5 races. That was 22. Last year, a really strong first 5 races, great win in Baku, just had the edge on Max all weekend. Then from Spain, a really poor mid-season, 11 races, nowhere again, before a bounce back to respectability last 5 races. This year, reasonable start, Bahrain and Miami, all looking okay, first 6 races. Front row next to Max in Suzuka and Shanghai, plenty of points. He was somewhere between 2 and 4 tenths off Max, but doing the job required of him. But then from Imola onwards, nowhere again. Out in Q1 3 times in the last 6 races. Only made Q3 twice, and even then a long way off the pace. But now, as we talked about, plenty of other teams to get in between Max and him. It's like he bounces back into a new season, builds on that respectable end of the previous season. But as Max then gets more from the car as it's developed, it's as if the grind and strain of trying to stay with Max creates some sort of crisis of confidence, which lasts for a lot of the season. He's missing in action for around half the season. That just seems to be the pattern.
It looks also, though, that if we bake in 2 or 3 tenths that he's behind Max in qualifying, because Sergio is just not as strong a qualifier, and the whole field is bunched up within 8 or 9 tenths in Q1, he is so vulnerable in Q1 and Q2, and he'll need extra tires to go through. And we saw this the last few races again, that he's just burning through softs to get there, and then he doesn't have anything left if he actually gets to Q3.
Yeah.
But I also think he's not really being helped by his side of the garage. There have been some iffy calls where they just say, okay, you should be as good as Max to make this work. And sometimes it almost feels like he needs a little bit of more support and a safe strategy to get through and not really go for the iffy calls.
Yeah, it's the interesting thing, isn't it? because there's always trouble for drivers in his scenario. Good drivers up against great drivers tend to be made to look very, very poor. But obviously, Perez probably is at the point now where he's sat there thinking, well, actually, I should be getting a little bit more from the team on this, that, or the other. So that just adds to the situation, doesn't it, Nelson? Because it'll be creating strain in the team.
Absolutely, and as those two sides of the garage diverge, so too becomes it even more problematic for Perez, because they really do need him, as you say, to fight off not only in the Constructors' Championship McLaren and Mercedes and potentially Ferrari, but also for race wins. Verstappen cannot do this on his own every Sunday. And we saw that in Silverstone, how hamstrung you are when you're just one car at the front. And you can't always outperform the car. You can't always be a better driver in certain situations than the competition. So he'll need a good Perez close by, and he's just not getting that as well.
Yeah, it has a significance in the Drivers' Championship as well. I think Verstappen's got a big enough lead this year on that side of things to be fine. But next year, you need a rear gunner because, as I like to say, the one thing Max Verstappen can't do is drive both cars. So it does seem that Red Bull are seriously evaluating this. Now, we'll talk about potential replacement candidates in part 2 of the podcast. But Mark, if you were sat there now, it's your decision. I think you've basically said before, and I'll still say with you take him out, don't you, at the break?
Yeah, you do. You're trying to win this Constructors' Championship. You can't just sort of bet that it's going to come right. I think for me, the easiest, simplest solution, given that you have a second team, is put Tsunoda in the Red Bull and replace him at RB with Lawson. But there seems to be a reluctance from Christian Horner to consider Tsunoda for some reason. Maybe it's a hangover from his wild early days in the perception. But he's a pretty consistent performer these days, and you've got half a chance there, I think, rather than certainly a better chance than with a crisis mode Perez. And I think that's probably what I'd do as the easiest solution. Thinking out the box, thinking, is there something else better even possible? You really want a proper potential winning driver in there, someone you can absolutely rely upon to be around the fight, to fight the McLarens and the Mercs and Ferraris and have a good chance of coming out on top. That would be someone like Carlos Sainz, who you'd then have as an insurance in case Max walked away at the end of the year. But obviously that involves negotiating with Ferrari to get him out half a season early, and that's probably way too complex to arrange mid-season. But in an ideal world, I'd probably pay Ferrari a fortune for Sainz to get him out of the contract for the second half of this season. Then I'd already have Sainz in place in case Max leaves. Ferrari could replace Sainz with Behrman for half a season. Everyone is a winner. But unlikely.
Everyone except Perez.
But I think he's doomed regardless. So Daniel, I don't think he's done anything like enough to justify putting into the big team. I think you'd be exchanging one problem for another. But it's all a bit of a muddle from, given that this is a team that has this junior driver program and a second team. But I guess that's what happens when you're looking for the world champion. You're looking for the next big thing, and there's not many of them are. So there's always this dissatisfaction with what you've got. And it's produced 2 world champions. Is there a third there at the moment? Maybe not at the moment, but that's just where you are.
But the Verstappen angle is quite interesting here. I spoke to Jos in an interview in Austria, and he basically said, after asking me to do the interview in front of the Mercedes garage, we will stay with this team. We will stay with this team as long as they have a winning car. That's the exact line he told me. And it is that fear that is potentially prompting this as well with Perez, to give them some wiggle room, some options if the worst would actually come to pass for 26 or even 25, which I do not believe, but potentially for 26 it could mean that Verstappen would be leaving. And what do you do then?
That's a good point. It reminds me a little bit of 10 years ago, the situation when Ferrari signed Kimi Räikkönen for 2014, and that was slightly motivated by the concern that they might lose Alonso, which ultimately they did a year later. But they wanted to make sure they banked sort of a top liner. He was obviously doing very good things for Lotus, Enstone Lotus at that time. maybe didn't quite pan out as hoped for Ferrari with Raikkonen, but that was part of the methodology. But they will have that in mind. But do we think Perez is beyond hope? Nelson, do you see him in what he's saying, in what he's doing, showing any signs of breaking through it and things clicking again?
And the problem is the pattern, as Mark said. It is a repeating pattern, and there is no indication that he's breaking that pattern. In fact, he's getting worse, it seems. Also not helped by the fact that this car is worse compared to the others than it was in 23 and 22. But for me, Perez was never supposed to be a long-term prospect for Red Bull, and he's been there for longer than I probably expected. But it just seems that there is a ceiling there, that he keeps on hitting. And with this car, he can't really do the thing he loves, which is really outperform the tires, make them go and go and go. It doesn't play to his strengths. And with the season slump, as it always happens for the last 3 years, I just don't see him turning this around. Plus, he's got perception against him as well. Public perception. People are starting to cry out for it a little bit. And that influences decision makers. Not Helmut Marko or Christian Horner, but the people above. They are hearing the noise as well.
Yeah, he probably at this stage needs to go to Hungary and go to Spa and perform very well and be right up there at the front podium contention to save himself at this stage. Helmut Marko's admitted that they're going to have a look at it over the summer, and that was originally taken to mean for next year. But yeah, the whole thing seems to be in a state of flux, and it's hard to see Perez doing anything about that.
Yeah, the problem is being in podium contention means now that you have to be just as quick as Max. Not 2 tenths off, you need to be right there because the car is not there.
Yeah, that's a good point. You can't rely on the car being half a second clear of the field, and if Checo's 2 or 3 tenths off, it doesn't really matter. But you can't rely on that anymore.
Yeah, exactly. And there'll be a point where Ferrari sort themselves out again. They've been very much fourth best the past few races, but they'll be back there, and then it'll be even harder to do. So yeah, Perez feeling like he's under pressure from all angles, and it'd be interesting if they were to drop him, which would be a huge move for the second half of the year. That also throws him onto the driver market as well, which is something we've talked about the possibility of before. So he'd be of interest to teams lower down the order potentially.
That's all we need. Another competent driver on the driver market.
It's just going to keep happening, isn't it? It'll just keep shuffling. Probably carry on all the way through to March at the rate it's going. But yeah, Perez, this is looking pretty serious for him. The best thing he can do is absolutely nail the next 2 races. But yeah, not putting any money on that.
You know we love talking stats here at The Athletic. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cash Back Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right. You could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/credit card.
We'll get back to the pod in a moment, but first of all, let me tell you about Grammarly. Email, Google Docs, Slack, you write across multiple platforms and places during your workday, so delivering consistent, high-quality communication everywhere is key. Grammarly is an AI writing partner that helps you get work done faster with high-quality writing for better projects, proposals, presentations, and more. Best of all, Grammarly works where you work, so you can get more done no matter what tools you use. As a journalist and podcast host, I'm constantly writing and rewriting copy and drawing up scripts. It's part of the job, and Grammarly helps make it faster. It's got some really cool features like tone suggestions to help you strike the right balance between direct and friendly in work emails. Plus, Grammarly has a ton of other great features like advanced spelling, grammar, punctuation, and conciseness suggestions to ensure your writing is professional, mistake-free, and clear. Get AI writing support that works where you work. Sign up and download for free at grammarly.com/podcast. That's GRAMMARLY.com/podcast. Easier said, done. Let's move on to Liam Lawson, because he actually seems to have a realistic chance of being selected if Perez is replaced. Daniel Ricciardo's also in with a shout. Tsunoda, the driver you mentioned earlier, they just seem to have put a line through in terms of Red Bull racing. I just don't think they don't think he has the mentality, which I think is a shame because he's been performing really well. So Lawson and Ricciardo, what would your approach to this conundrum be?
For me, it would be put Lawson in. That's the mind's choice. The hard choice potentially for Christian Horner would be to put in Ricciardo for half a season and call it quits after that, and then put Lawson in at VCarb. But you have to put Lawson in. He's done so well. Plus, he's shown himself also very loyal, never to speak out of turn. Think he's earned a chance, but it's very hard on Tsunoda. The point I'll make for Tsunoda is we need him to take the points for VCarb because we can't change everything around that team. But Lawson, this is his golden opportunity. We don't know how well the test might have gone, but he's done so much in the background to earn himself this chance that I have a feeling it's going to be Lawson.
That'd be extraordinary, wouldn't it, Mark, for Lawson to be chucked into a Red Bull racing car? Yeah,
and I mean he did, absolutely everything that could have been asked of him as a stand-in last year. So why not? Why not give him his chance? I think he might just be one of those guys that just gets better and better as the occasion gets bigger. He's got a good, solid junior CV, but nothing stellar. But the way he performed as a rookie last year, and I'm thinking back in particular to Suzuka, and he was scrapping from first lap until the very end with Tsunoda, and actually came out on top. I think he's done enough that there's the possibility there that he might develop into something really, really good. So, yeah, I can see the logic of it.
Lawson feels to me like a Carlos Sainz type of guy. We're not always thinking of him as the top driver that's available, but he's such a hard worker and he's so diligent in what he does that he actually outperforms our expectations. And Lawson might be just that guy as well.
The thing that's interesting with Lawson is if you look at him historically through the junior categories, he's generally started very strongly. Maybe got kind of to his ceiling fairly quickly. Nelson, obviously you follow this sort of thing very, very closely, so you may think that's a bit unfair, but he seems like a guy who's got a good head on him who can, if he was thrown into a Red Bull car, I think he'd actually deal with it quite well within the context of him being a guy who's done 5 Grand Prix weekends.
Well, what I think he did so well last year is he didn't try to use it as an audition, like throw out everything that he knew and just go for it. No, he knew Ricciardo had a signed deal, so he knew it was just for 5 races until he would be fit again, and he tried to race within himself and let the races come to him. And Singapore was a really good race in that respect, and let the points come to him as well. So I'm not sure about his ultimate potential, but he's got such a good head and a good attitude that he'll also very often will get to his ultimate potential. And that's what I learned last year. So if he's chucked into the Red Bull and they're saying, okay, it's going to be for the second half of the season, you are definite for a seat. We just don't know which team. He might relax and do the same job he did last year.
Yeah, and people may forget actually how quick he was last year. I think in dry qualifying he was about 0.14 off Tsunoda on average, which in the circumstances was excellent. Did a very, very calm job at Zandvoort when he jumped in on Saturday. Wet conditions, obviously his pace wasn't stellar, but that wasn't the challenge for him that weekend. It finished all a little bit on a low note. Qatar was probably definitely his least impressive weekend. I remember asking him after the race on Sunday, it's like, well, all in all, looking at this whole run, you must be pretty pleased that you've made such a good case for yourself. And he said, well, yeah, I'm a bit disappointed it's ended this way, though. So, yeah, he's definitely somebody who has the ability to do a good job. We don't really know how he manage up against Verstappen, and there's a bit of a risk, I would say, if you're looking for a banker driver who'll score okay, which is what they need in the second half of the season just to close out that Constructors' Championship. He's certainly capable of consistent points, but you'd be slightly less sure of him in terms of what you're going to get than some other drivers. And of course, Daniel Ricciardo's the interesting case. He's got all the experience, hasn't he? And so, Mark, would you look at Ricciardo and think, well, he's a guy who's got experience and probably would come out of the season with more points than Lawson? Or maybe would you be worried that it would just be a very different equation?
Yeah, I just not seen the consistency from Daniel. You see moments of the old Daniel. We've seen it a couple of times this year, but it's just he's not stringing it together, and it doesn't seem to be resonating with him what exactly is going wrong, and it's just a continuation of his problems from McLaren. I just would not be confident in that being the guy that would get me out of trouble. I think I'd rather put my chips on somebody like Lawson than Daniel.
But this is when it becomes a matter of the heart. And if Christian Horner really, really believes that Daniel deserves this chance, you could imagine the whole Red Bull family putting him in for half a season. And if he doesn't stack up, and we all think that he's not doing the job we all hoped he would do. But if that continues in a Red Bull, it's the end of the line, basically. So you then have half of a season with Lawson in the V-Carb. You've got half of a season with Daniel in the Red Bull. And in the meantime, I'm pretty sure Carlos Sainz is talking to Red Bull and seeing how this all shakes out. And we might well end up with Lawson staying at VCARB and then parachuting in Sainz for next year to have the insurance policy against Verstappen leaving. That's a scenario, but it takes a lot of goodwill from a lot of drivers to make that work.
It's frankly an enormous mess, isn't it? It's ridiculous. Red Bull's the top team in Formula One. They're unique in that they've got a second team. They've got their big driver program. This should be so stable and well organised. There should always be a clear next cab off the rank, shouldn't there? If they were properly choosing their drivers and running everything sensibly. And it feels to me like just the kind of scattergun approach that Helmut Marko's taken over the years has seemed increasingly anachronistic. And now you're just in this mess compounded by, obviously, the Verstappen situation. I find it astonishing, Nelson, because this team, Red Bull, is so good in everything it does, yet its driver approach is just madness.
And it's not the first time. Every time something goes wrong, whether it's Pierre Gasly or Alex Albon or Carlos Sainz moving or Daniel Ricciardo moving, they are without any plan B. It's always like they're good until something happens and then they hadn't thought it exactly through. Don't forget, we've got a Red Bull Junior leading F2. We haven't mentioned Isaac Hadjar. He's knocking on the door. He might keep on knocking, but it may come to nothing. But it's every time something happens on the driver market, it's like Red Bull has created a situation where they also cannot react. And maybe that's part of this with Perez. They want room to be able to react. And you need to say goodbye to a driver, at least one, to be able to do that. But it is astounding that year after year, this keeps happening to them.
Yeah, and you'd want to be able to react at a time when everyone else hasn't taken themselves off the market as well. That's the thing. It's bizarre. I mean, as we said, it may well be that Perez's new deal made it easier to drop in mid-season in that regard, because obviously the performance clauses vary from deal to deal. So that might have played a part in it. But yeah, it's just extraordinary. And yeah, Hadjar's an interesting case. I know he didn't make a massive impression on Red Bull with his FP1 that he did at Silverstone. Didn't necessarily have the most flattering programme, but even then they weren't absolutely delighted with it, which is odd because I was quite impressed with him when he did Mexico last year, particularly for AlphaTauri. But Mark, you followed this for years. It almost feels like when it works, it's almost through luck rather than judgment. You think of all these things going back, and when they brought Brendan Hartley in, having dropped him years before, Alex Albon they brought back having dropped him, and Daniel Kvyat got chucked out and then they brought him back. It just seems astonishing. They should have all this driver weaponry in their armoury, and it's totally mismanaged.
Yeah, it's very binary, isn't it? It's like perform or you're out, and then we've thrown out some people we could be looking at again. I don't think there is that much science in it. I think it is the project of Helmut Marko, and I think that is the way he looks at it. He's very demanding, but without. I don't think he's got much time for understanding what problems a driver may be having. It's just a demand for performance, and if you're not producing it, well, then you're not a potential world champion. So we'll look for the next one. Thank you very much. And they've come in for a lot of criticism for that. On the other hand, those drivers that do get their chance there have often gone on to have very, very solid careers in other forms of racing, which they wouldn't have had they not been picked up by Red Bull in the first place. So I think you can't be too critical of it in that sense. But in terms of how it feeds in to the top team, I think, just going back to what I said earlier, I think it's Marco sees this as the search for the next world champion. He doesn't see it as a search for a steady supply of keeping everything fed. He's looking for the next big thing. And so he just, it's, I don't know if scattergun is the right approach, but right description, but it's more, he's not really thinking about how this feeds into the whole group. He's thinking about, let's find another Seb Vettel, let's find another Max Verstappen. Who is it? Oh, it's not this guy. Right, next. It's more that, I think.
He's looking for a lead actor, and it leaves him without a supporting cast. And that's what's happening every time now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, that's maybe something they need to think about a little bit more, because that is part of the equation. And they have to be careful as well, because there's so much science being applied to driver recruitments. It's a bit like football clubs now, that you've now got multiple F1 teams who are really scouring the ranks of karting to pick up these people. Obviously, Mercedes got Kimi Antonelli, and there's a danger Red Bull could be a bit left behind by that and missed out on people. That said, they have got Arvid Lindblad, who's very highly rated, so he's there coming through. But when you consider the way Mercedes does it, and their the detail Mercedes goes into with their recruits, and also their structuring. I remember when they looked at Logan Sargent, for example. One of the reasons they didn't take him, they thought he was pretty good, but he didn't fit in with the age profile of the drivers they had. So they're thinking, right, we want drivers in this slot, this slot, this slot. Whereas you feel like Helmut Marko would sign someone, whether they're 40 or 14, if he's just caught their eye on track with what they're doing.
Yeah, he's very... he feels like impulse-driven sometimes, Helmut Marko. I'm just wondering how much of this is Helmut Marko at this point with Sergio Perez. We've seen the whole power dynamic changing at Red Bull and the struggles at the beginning of the year. And I asked Helmut Marko in Austria, are you the one calling the shots on the drivers? And he didn't say yes. He ran around it twice, and I think 2 or 3 years ago, he would have said yes. And it's just a different situation there, which, it makes it even more muddy, these waters. It's nice, though. We went 28 minutes without mentioning football. Ed, thank you for that.
I've been waiting to save it. I thought we'd throw it in, but I wouldn't. Well, I've already bothered you about that by WhatsApp anyway. So I feel like I got it in, but we won't get talking about penalty calls. No.
I'm still rooting for Colombia in the Copa America for my the other side in this household, so we're all good here.
Excellent, yeah, some consolation there. But certainly football seems relatively simple by comparison to the Red Bull driver conundrum. Well, let's get on to the final part of our Red Bull discussion, and that's, Nelson, about Max Verstappen, because that persistent noise about Mercedes signing him, it's not going away, is it? So what would you do if you're in Max's position? Would you just shut it all down completely, or be looking to get out of Red Bull, or would you sort of hold a middle line and try and go which way you feel is right when you know how things are playing out?
Well, it's interesting to see Max being so incredibly diplomatic when he's caught in between a crossfire between Horner and his father. And he's remained diplomatic all throughout the season. It is very interesting to see that he's perhaps performing at a more mature level also in the car that we've ever seen. Look what which races he's winning. He's doing it on pure class, and like the stint on slicks in Montreal with the semi-damp road, he was so much faster than anybody else. We're seeing still Max's true colors, but he's being very mature about the situation they're in, at least in front of the camera. I can only imagine what it is like behind the scenes, though, when the car is not performing in the way that he likes. And he's been clear on the radio that he's been saying this all along. It sounds like he's very frustrated. So there's going to be a point that this bubble's over, and maybe even into the public realm. But for now, I think he'll keep on taking the middle road, because that leaves his options open as well.
Yeah, I do wonder if he's sat there thinking, I'm carrying this team at this stage. Now, yes, it's a team effort, but we know, Mark, don't we, that he's been giving feedback about the ride problem for a long time that's maybe not been acted on as much as he'd like. So you could imagine that there's sort of hints in the way he's doing things that there's some genuine annoyance there.
Yes, it's true. And I think the way he interacts with the team behind the scenes is very blunt, and that it's so hard to make a judgment in his position about the future. You've got the post Adrian Newey technical department. Are they going to suddenly flower and produce another stunning car, and does that change his perception and make him think, well, maybe this is the place to be? Or what is the reality on the 2026 power unit, and where is everyone at in that? So it's not clear cut at all. And yeah, as far as I understand, is what Jos would prefer isn't what Max is. Max is not automatically doing just what Jos wants to do. So yeah, there's a lot going on, and it's I think it's really a testimony to Max's maturity that with all this still going on, he just gets in the car and delivers, and is still delivering better than anyone else.
What's interesting to me is that Max doesn't seem surprised that they're on the back foot. No, he's not shocked. He isn't panicking. It's almost like, yeah, I knew this was going to happen, and I'm, as Mark says, getting on with the job. That's one part of the equation. And I think if you're Max, you're going to look at George Russell and Lewis Hamilton now that he's a little bit older and think, I will be faster than them in the same car, so I could get the title with Mercedes or McLaren. That must be part of his thinking. So that frees up some opportunities there. I don't think he's afraid to go to Mercedes. I think it's a question of wanting, and for him personally, not for Jos, not for management, not for everybody around him, but for him, he hasn't reached that point, it seems, that he wants to leave.
I like the fact that Wolf is there, continually throwing in these little grenades. Whenever anyone asks him about Max Verstappen, he will say something that's a little bit of a nudge, just to send the message out and plant the idea, our engine program's looking good for 26 and all of that kind of thing. So I quite like that strategy from Mercedes. But Mark, they do genuinely seem to think they've got half a chance of getting him at some point, don't they?
Oh, yes. And I think just echoing what Nelson said earlier on, I think 26 is very realistic. 25, not impossible, but my sense is that he won't gamble on 25.
What does it say, though, at Mercedes about how they view George Russell? Because if they continuously keep going after Max like this, there's a signal to Russell that we don't believe that you're the guy to carry us forward in a direct fight with Max. It must be difficult for George.
Yeah, I guess he's just got to back himself to be able to take Max on, hasn't he? Obviously, publicly, he's dismissed it as a problem, but it will play on his mind. But I think I do kind of agree with Wolf's position that you'll, as he said, you do handstands to get Max Verstappen if you can, because Verstappen is so good. And we're seeing that in this run of races, even more clearly exposed than during the dominant period. It just shows how brilliant he is. But I just wanted to go back to the whole thing with Jos Verstappen and Max, because obviously Max has talked about the fact it's a very close-knit unit. It's him, Jos Verstappen, and Raymond Vermeulen, his manager. But Max is not a puppet of Jos, is he? So that's the really fascinating dynamic there. How much sway Jos has, because if he had complete control, probably Verstappen would have signed for Mercedes by now. But equally, he is a valued part of Max's inner circle, isn't he?
I think they make decisions with the three of them in unison. I don't think a decision can be made with one of the three parties, Raymond, Jos, or Max, not being in agreement. And that is actually quite a healthy way of looking at it, apart from everything that's happening around them. The noise, the thing that happened in Austria really wasn't helpful. But it's just so difficult, I think, for Max to be caught in the middle of the noise. That's why he needs Jos and Raymond in the background to be united with him. And we will never really know what the situation there is. But I know that they've did this journey together, and I don't think there's disunity between Jos and Max at all.
Yeah, you can be in a position where you disagree but not be disunited is perhaps the best way to put it.
Yeah, totally.
But the interesting thing is that the technical progress of that team, Mark, because they do seem a little bit boxed in by this car. That I would say the Red Bull is still the fastest car, but it's on such a knife edge, it's such a narrow window that you could argue the McLaren is the better car now because it's a good all-rounder. And
when everything, if you could get every car into its total sweet spot, yes, the Red Bull I think is still the quickest car. It still has the most high-speed downforce, but I think it's less flexible than the McLaren. McLaren is fast everywhere. The Red Bull is more sensitive. It looks to have more areas that need to be taken into consideration when working out where to put the car at the beginning of the weekend in terms of setup, in terms of wing levels, etc. I think, the McLaren is an easier car to operate. The Mercedes looks now, since it's certainly in the last couple of races, similar in its traits to the McLaren, and in some respects may even have an edge on it in the high speed. So I think the Red Bull is still ultimately in Max's hands, the quickest. So that I think potentially, if everybody gets everything out of their package, it's still the fastest, but it's not always the case.
The advantage in 22 and also last year was so that they didn't need to be greedy with downforce levels on that car.
Yeah.
Now they need to be greedy to be able to compete. And that greed leads to a very narrow operating window. And it's so difficult to get it right out of the truck, as it were. They always seem to be having to go back to the simulator on a Friday to get it ready for the Saturday. And even then, where was it, in Austria? That the Saturday performance didn't translate to the Sunday performance. So sometimes they are left scratching their head. It's been a while since we saw Red Bull scratching their head on their car. But it is, as Mark says, a very difficult car to get the most out of lap after lap. And that's maybe the problem there.
There's also a dimension of ongoing development in the rest of the season, and that's what we don't really know. It could be that this is getting so close to the peak of the cars under these rules that they're okay, that if Red Bull Limited, well, McLaren, they said they're now, the days of these big packages for them where they take big leaps are done. They've done all that, and now it's just this constant iterative process. Seems to be the same thing for Mercedes. So that's the question I don't think anyone really knows the answer to. Which direction has the greater upside? And I'd be very surprised if we do see the development and the progress completely levelling off, because they always find ways to do it. So I don't know about you, Mark, but I don't really know how the development war might run in the next couple of races. And certainly we'll probably see some reasonable packages at the very least up to Singapore time, then bits and pieces after that. So we could have a point where Red Bull is genuinely not even anymore the fastest car when everything's right later in the year.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember at the launch, Adrian Newey saying that he expected this to level out in the latter part of the season. He was convinced that they were already very near the potential of this regulation set, and that he couldn't see that there were many big gains to come. And so he even said back then that he was expecting a sterner challenge from the other teams. And Mercedes certainly looks like it's on a very fruitful part of the development curve, and we still, every time McLaren does an upgrade, it seems to work. It seems their correlation is fantastic. And they design something, they put it on the car, and the car goes quicker. And you don't seem to have these nightmare Fridays where they have to rethink everything and go back and come up with something else for Saturday, like Nelson was talking about with the Red Bull.
Yeah, and it's not an extra challenge they need, really, given everything that's going on off track, the question marks over drivers, obviously Adrian Newey's heading off, all the just drama about who's in control, etc., that just never seems to be ending. It just feels like we're at a point where Red Bull could send itself in one or two directions, couldn't it, Nelson? It could be just the sort of, it's sort of still close to its peak, but there could be just a bit of general degradation going on that means by the time we get to 26, especially if the power unit isn't quite there with the market leaders, where suddenly it just goes back to being just another team again.
Well, 25 could be quite bruising for them. If this leveling off continues, then it's all about driver lineups, maximizing your chances. Still, you've got the best driver in the field in your car, but it won't be easy. It's not easy now, and we suspect it to be the case in 25 as well. So, indeed, if they then also have problems with their powertrain, and you keep hearing these stories, but for now they're just stories. If that is the case, it creates a very unhappy situation, and I cannot imagine the three we just spoke about, Raymond, Jos, Max, not figuring that out early enough to see what their options are. And that's with this whole Perez situation, that's continuously in the background. What does Max do? So it all ties in really nicely together like that.
Yeah, I can't think of a time in F1 history, really, where, certainly not in the past 30 years or so, where a team that's so good, and this team's so strong in so many areas. Just look at how well they execute race weekends generally as well. And, yes, they had a pit stop error in Austria, but they're so rare. This team is so sharp and well drilled. Yet there's so many question marks. Can you think of any parallels, Mark, to teams being in such a baffling situation, or is it just unique, isn't it?
I'm struggling, yeah. I mean, the end of the Williams era, end of 97, when we're suddenly looking at being a customer engine team, and sort of downgrading of their status, and that was sort of reflected on track. I suppose that's the nearest, but no, there's no obvious parallels.
Yeah, perhaps Benetton, 95, 96, everybody of worth leaving, and suddenly you're left with a midfield team.
Yeah, that's not a bad comparison. It's a slightly different mechanism in that I think quite a few people moved there because they knew. I know Schumacher moved to Ferrari. He didn't think Benetton could stay on top for forever, although that could be the mindset that Verstappen's got, but different reasons, isn't it? There's both those examples there, Williams and Benetton. There were technical reasons why you could argue that's the case. I don't think there's a specific technical reason beyond maybe the engine program, if you want to include that, why you'd jump out of Red Bull. But yeah, absolutely extraordinary situation. And I just don't know where they're going to be 18 months down the line. They could still be the mighty team on top, and I wouldn't be surprised if they are. But I do have this feeling that everything just needs to be got a little bit under control, because it all feels just like the car. It's all a bit on a knife edge. So I'm sure there's going to be plenty more talk about this over the rest of the year. But thanks very much, Mark and Nelson. Great insights there. I'm sure there's going to be plenty of other opportunities to talk about what's going on at Red Bull. Let's see what happens driver lineup-wise in the coming weeks. But for now, we're going to turn our attention to Hungary. So stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.
The Athletic.